Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian.moore.
We are doing this as a remote recording with me in London and Sebastian in Manchester.
But we will have a guest in the studio with me.
Superb. I was about to say that, and we're going to be joined in Manchester by our special guest this week, Alex Moore, who's going to talk about small businesses and some of the challenges they face. So we're following our usual choreography this week. There's a little hint there to what might be coming later in Culture Club. So I'm going to talk about the growth agenda of the government, particularly some of the things that they've been announcing, like the third runway at Heathrow. Sebastian, you want to talk about some of the news from the world of AI and Deepseek and those issues. And as usual, we will keep you hanging on to find out what we're going to talk about in Culture Club. So, Sebastian, do you want to go first, talking about this news story on AI?
Yeah, so, I mean, this broke earlier in the week. And when I saw the story, it was leading most major news organisations in the UK, which kind of tells you that this is a bigger story than you might have originally thought, because these AI models, so they're called LLMs, large language models. And most people will be familiar with them through things like ChatGPT or Gemini is the Google version. In the last couple of years, there have been a huge number of these models coming out all the time. And so on the face of it, you think, okay, there's a new one out. Why is that such big news? Well, it's big news because it kind of shook the AI world. Deepseek is this Chinese LLM, and essentially it has managed to they've managed to create a model with a huge level of accuracy that rivals something like ChatGPT, but they've done it on a fraction of the cost. And this is the important bit to a lot of people, they've done it with a fraction of the processing power. So a company called NVIDIA. So NVIDIA, they produce these things called GPUs. So GPU, have you heard of a GPU before?
They're chips, are they? Chips?
Yeah, I guess so. They're graphics processing units. I imagine they come under the term chips, yeah. They are, I mean, everybody will have one of these in the computer that they're using. NVIDIA are the sort of the world leader in them, and that's why you might have seen that NVIDIA's stock price has risen hugely in the last few years. But it took a tumble earlier this week when Deepseek launched their model, and that sort of sent shockwaves through the not just the tech world, but also the business world.
It did. That's why I was aware of it, to be honest.
Because of the NVIDIA's falling stock?
Yeah, the effect on markets, yeah. So, lots of people were worrying that this is the start of a big stock market crash, potentially.
So I wanted to just take a step back and sort of talk about AI and a few of the maybe misconceptions surrounding artificial intelligence, because I think there is a disconnect from the people that understand this stuff to the majority of people that kind of the users in effect, because a lot of the reports on this will talk about things that perhaps as a user you're not necessarily aware of, and we kind of only care about the end result. We care, is it free to use? Does it help me with my daily tasks? So I've been in situations before where I don't know if you had this, where you'll be at the supermarket and they've closed all the checkouts and you've got the self-service machines, and somebody will comment something like, oh, this is the rise of the machines, here's AI. Now, that isn't AI. That would be called, do you know what we call the term for that? Machines replacing humans in terms of functional tasks.
I'm not sure I do know a word for that.
Automation.
Automation, of course, yes.
So automation is a really interesting aspect politically, and it's something I think we should definitely talk about in a future episode. Automation has been happening for hundreds of years. I'm going
to do that old lady thing and say, my bank's turned into a wine bar.
Your bank's turned into a wine bar?
Yes, that was on an advert a while ago, I think.
Yeah. But it is frustrating, I think, when people want to deal with a human being and they've got a machine in front of them. And it also has huge implications for the workforce and what jobs people are going to be doing in 10, 20 years' time, or even today, really. So things like self-driving cars and other stuff, that it's a very interesting topic. AI is slightly different. So artificial intelligence would be any attempt to mimic the intelligence displayed by human beings in a machine. And in order to do this, you have something called machine learning, which you might have heard about. Now, machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence, and this enables computers and machines to imitate the way that humans learn. So now we come on to LLMs. So large language models like ChatGPT and Deepseek and Copilot and Gemini, they are what people would know as predictive text-based models, right? And you can do other things on them, but generally I will ask a question to ChatGPT and it will come up with an answer, and it's basically predicting what the word is that, what word comes next. Makes sense? Now,
yes,
I think this tends to have an effect on people where they minimize the impact of AI because they say, all it's doing is predicting what word comes next. And I think, well, yeah, in a way, but that's kind of what human beings are doing on some level. We're just predicting the next word. And often we're not doing it to a great degree of accuracy. So AI it's certainly these LLMs they're already having a huge role to play in businesses, schools, hospitals. They do have a massive function, and who knows what can come of that as well. And one of the really interesting things about Deepseek, and I think this is the thing that's perhaps the most important revelation this week, is that it's open source. So Deepseek, you might read this story and think, okay, it was created by a Chinese company, backed by a Chinese hedge fund. That's hard to say. And it's having an impact on American tech companies. You might think, okay, the war is being won by the East. Now, it being open source is really, really good news for the tech world, because it means that essentially open source software means that it shows the source code, and it allows users to change that and reproduce it and release something. Now, OpenAI, who do ChatGPT, sort of counterintuitively, as you might expect OpenAI to be open source, it's not, it's closed. So you can't actually see what's going on, whereas DeepSeek, you can. If you pair that with the fact that it requires much less processing power, and why it requires much less processing power is a rabbit hole that I've gone down and probably we shouldn't get into now, but essentially the fact that it requires less processing power means that far more people can get involved in this. I was listening to a researcher at a university in the UK who was saying, brilliant, I can take this now and start doing stuff with it, whereas I couldn't do that before. Before, it was left in the hands of the huge tech companies who were the only ones that could afford, hundreds of thousands of these GPUs that were required to train new models.
So the fact that it's open source means that because anybody can use it, that means worldwide there will be a much lower demand for these GPUs.
Exactly, yeah.
And GPUs are kind of a real thing made in the real world. They're not virtual. So that means real jobs for real people and real businesses being affected by this.
Yeah, and if you think about if you think about something like memory cards and what you can do, a good example of this would be a camera, right? A camera back in the day would be filming pretty low quality footage, and it require a small amount of memory. Then cameras would get much, much more technologically advanced, and they'd suddenly eat up the memory that you needed. And then memory cards would grow, and you have nowadays like 6 terabyte hard drives that can fit in your pocket. And that process of sort of the capability the capability sort of keeping pace with the technology, doesn't always go hand in hand. And this is a case where the technology, there are some technological advances with Deepseek and when you look into the more technicalities of it, but the real story is the capability in terms of not requiring so much processing power. Because people talk constantly about, in the world of AI, we're going to be using a huge amount of power and we're going to need to generate so much more electricity. And actually, as the tech advances, we have workarounds for that and we have ways of minimizing it.
So this is a good news story.
I think so, yes.
It's just in the financial world, it's been kind of presented as a bit of a nightmare scenario. So it's good that it's good news.
Yeah, I suppose.
It will allow lots more people to make use of an AI solution in lots of different circumstances.
Yes, and I think what is best for the stock market isn't always what's best for society and vice versa.
Absolutely, yeah. Can I just ask one question? So it uses fewer chips, fewer CPUs. Does it also use less power? Because that's the other thing that people talk about a lot when they talk about AI, that it's very, very power hungry.
So the type of GPU it's using it's about half the processing power of the GPUs that ChatGPT used to train that model. So not only is it using fewer of them, it's also using they are of less power, and that is my sort of layman's understanding of it. Yeah, in terms of the energy it's using, like if we think about the sort of what we as non-techie people understand, like how much electricity it's using, far, far less. Right. The other aspect I've not mentioned but is relevant here, and this sort of is what the news articles led with, is the cost of developing this model. So this model cost about $5.5 million. The amount of money that companies like Meta, for example, are spending on their large language models, which Llama is their one, it's just astronomical compared to this. Something, like 100 billion. It's like 100,000 million compared to the 5 million spent on this. So it's a complete game changer, and it changes the way that tech firms have been approaching this subject of large language models, because up until now they've been thinking we need more and more GPUs, we need more processing power, and Deepseek have kind of turned that on its head and said, well, maybe we don't.
So probably a stupid question, but I'll ask it anyway. When we started using Chinese products in our telecom system, we got very worried that would give China access to information. Is there anything in this code that would actually make it possible for China to make use of it?
Right. So if you use Deepseek, yes, the company that created it will be able to see what you're inputting. However, because it's open source, people can take this model and host it locally, and then they won't be able to spy on you as such. And there are political implications of this. You look at some of the questions that Deepseek is unable to answer on things like Tiananmen Square and Taiwan. So there is a political angle to it for sure.
Good. So we're generally welcoming this as a good development, and one which will allow us to do more with less resources. So good news.
Yes. Okay. And then to a story that has a bit more impact on us in the UK directly. This news this week about the third runway at Heathrow.
Yeah, so Rachel Reeves gave a speech in Oxfordshire where she just kind of used growth as every other word. I think she used it about 50 times in the speech. And she promised that the government would be going further and faster. They like these sound bites, don't they? So you mentioned the third runway, just to give you a bit of a list of the projects that she mentioned in her speech. So the third runway at Heathrow, yes, but also expansion at London City Airport and at Stansted, Gatwick and the Doncaster Sheffield Airport. Confess I wasn't aware of that. There's also plans for what she called Europe's Silicon Valley. So that's the kind of corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, where they want to improve transport links, build new towns and a new cancer research hospital. 9 new reservoirs are on the cards. Something close to my heart, as you know, will be the redevelopment of Old Trafford That's not just the football stadium, that's the whole area. So they're planning to move the rail freight terminals and build a lot of housing there. Andy Burnham said they're planning to build 5,000 houses in the area. And the Lower Thames crossing. So all that looks really good, really exciting. But I confess I'm a little bit cynical for two reasons. Two things that the Chancellor said in her speech that seemed to me, well, either naive or a bit disingenuous. So she said she was genuinely shocked at the constant delays that are caused by our planning laws and the way that things can be blocked by the not in my backyard people and the environmentalists and local councils. And when she said that, I kind of thought, well, where have you been, Rachel? Those things we all know cause constant delays, and I was shocked that she was shocked. Kind of feels to me that many of those do-gooders are the people who turn up at each constituency Labour Party meeting, to be honest, so you'd think she might know about them. And then the other thing she said was that she said there is no trade-off between economic growth and net zero. Net zero is the industrial opportunity of the 21st century, and Britain must lead the way. But I would say it's absolutely clear that those two things are very clearly in opposition to each other. So we've talked before, haven't we, about our legally binding CO2 emissions, the limits on those. And that sets a clear restriction on economic growth. And the kind of enforced transition away from fossil fuels. That means we have the highest electricity prices in the developed world. And pretending that those things don't affect growth is I think, a bit silly. We mentioned, didn't we? We were talking the other day that we came to a point a couple of weeks ago where on a cold but windless day, we almost couldn't buy electricity at any price. And we know that those zero emissions vehicles mandates in terms of the timescale where we have to move to electric vehicles has been the cause of the closure of the Vauxhall van factory. We know that high energy costs have done for British Steel and in Port Talbot, and the ban on any further North Sea oil extraction is forcing the closure of Grangemouth. So it kind of felt to me that she was being a bit disingenuous in pretending that those net zero issues are not a factor in affecting the rate at which the country grows.
So it feels in some ways, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but we're 6 months into this Labour government, and it feels to me that there are similarities between this and the new governments under, let's say, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, that when a new Prime Minister comes in and has loads of ideas or, talks a good game, and then quite quickly you realise that their ideas are falling short of what's needed for the country.
Yeah, so I think we should be supportive of the idea that we need growth. I absolutely think we do need growth. But we do need to hold the government to account on some of the things that we know are holding back growth, but are also government policy. So, we need to really make sure that we hold their feet to the fire in terms of making sure growth happens. I think our last 3-quarter economic growth has been either minus 0.1 or plus 0.1. So, we're certainly not seeing growth. And of course, government needs time to enact its manifesto. But I just don't see where this growth is coming from. You can't make growth happen just by saying the word. We've talked before on the podcast about the kind of massive costs and delays when you try to build anything in the UK. It's kind of feels like we've forgotten how to build anything. And a big barrier, and one which Labour have recognised, is our planning system. So even when the planning system does allow development, it can massively increase costs, such as the enforced tunnelling on the HS2 route. The Town and Country Planning Act 1947 gave councils control over planning. And one of the impacts of that is that it's resulted in them often being hostage to small but vocal local interests. obviously, as we're Democrats, we think that people need to take account of local interests. But what we need to do is make sure that when planning happens, there's something in it for local communities. So one of our ideas is the idea that you levy a tax on the increase in the value of land that happens when it's granted planning permission. Because if you did that, then that development would mean that the tax revenue generated could be used to kind of place Meik. So to make sure that you don't just build houses, you also generate some tax revenue that can be used to build GP surgeries, schools, nurseries, all those kind of things, the amenities that a community needs. So the government has recognised this, and last week they started a consultation on CPOs. Do you know what they are?
CPOs?
Yeah. You see, it's such a long time since I think these were used widely. Compulsory purchase orders.
Yeah.
When I was young, they were quite a big talking point in communities. So this is where, because government or a council wants to develop an area of land, they require people to sell their property to them, and they pay them a compensation price. And the consultation that was launched last week was about the extent to which that price that is paid in a compulsory purchase should reflect what they term the hope value of a property. So let's say you have a piece of land that has perhaps been granted planning permission, but nobody's built on it. If there's a compulsory purchase order on that land, should the price paid reflect the value of the land with or without that planning permission? Because that planning permission having been granted but not having been used, should the landowner be compensated for that hope value? So it's quite an interesting consultation. I'm not quite sure what I think about it. I think it's important that we do uphold property rights and people are compensated if their property is kind of forcibly taken away from them. But the question of how do you value that property is quite an interesting one. And I think there shouldn't be a requirement on government to compensate somebody for the value that land might have if it were built upon. It's more, it should perhaps be less than that. So it's quite an interesting consultation.
It seems that there is an impending conflict between the sort of the people on the left that want growth and those that are green. Now, I think that language itself is I perhaps wouldn't agree with, because I'd say I'm green in a lot of ways. But when I think of the green left, I'm thinking of the people that sort of use these sound bites of climate change and they get all riled up about stuff. I was watching an interview with Carla Denyer, the co-leader of the Green Party, and I without being too rude about her, because she is somebody that's involved in politics and trying to do what she thinks is right for the country. I couldn't believe the ineptitude of her answers and just complete lack of understanding about basic economics and how a country works. It was astonishing. And I just thought maybe then that there would be, we'd call it like the green left. And I think of these people in North London metropolitan elites, and maybe the blue left, and we're probably a little bit more in line with the blue left. How do you see that playing out? Because Rachel Reeves is talking about growth and a new runway at Heathrow and these reservoirs, which I think are brilliant. We haven't built a reservoir since 1992.
I thought it was even before then, to be honest. But yes, I'll take your word for it.
So how do you see that conflict playing out amongst the Labour Party and amongst people on the left? Yeah,
it's a really good question, because I do think that there's a real potential that this Heathrow debate could tear the Labour Party apart. Because, as you say, there are many people who are actually quite anti-growth in their outlook. And particularly, they are... They worry about all those things like, not just the building of a third runway, but what that will mean in terms of, more flights, more airplanes, and the impact of those on the environment. So I would want to support a third runway. I think they've been planning a third runway for like decades, haven't they? There's a story, I don't know if it's a true story or not, that the ever expanding airport at Schiphol in the Netherlands, every time there's a failed attempt to build a third runway at Heathrow, they send a cake to the management at Heathrow. I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly a story that goes around, because obviously it creates more trade for them when we're unable to host more flights.
Yeah, exactly.
So yes, I think there will be a massive playing out of it. How will it end? I don't know. I worry that it will end with what you've called the Green Left winning and these plans being shelved yet again. But we really do need to start being a bit more realistic about the fact that if we really do want growth, we have to balance it against some of the other concerns that people have and make sure that we make sensible decisions.
So I think growth can come across as a term that's sort of professional and doesn't necessarily have heart to it. I think of it as we need innovation. We need to dream big and to do amazing things in this country, because that's kind of what we're supposed to do as human beings. It's what our ancestors did. And it's what every country should be trying to do, is develop and do its best for its citizens.
Yes, let's have high aspirations.
Absolutely.
In Bring Me Solutions this week, we are joined by Alex Moore, who is Sebastian's big brother.
Hello.
But more importantly, he's a local businessman, runs a number of hospitality venues. So, Alex, you want to talk about some of the threats to the hospitality industry and perhaps some of the solutions that you might see as being helpful to businesses like yours.
Absolutely. I mean, I hate to disagree with you straight away, but I would say that being Sebastian's brother is far more important than my job.
Ooh.
But yes, yeah, thank you very much for having me on.
And you just mentioned this, Hilary, and we didn't plan this, but we've turned up in the exact same jumper pretty much, and both taken our shoes off to record the podcast. So there are certain similarities.
I've also spent a lot of years getting told that we sound very similar. So I'm sure that on an audio format podcast, this might be a challenge for listeners.
That's true, isn't it? Especially if I deepen my voice just a little bit. That's the Alex sort of sound. Anyway, sorry, let's get back to the podcast. So can you just start by explaining what businesses you run? Because I think that's kind of relevant.
Yeah, I've got a background in hospitality, working in restaurants, pubs, bars, hotels, the lot, and set out on my own about 6 years ago and opened a coffee shop. It was a chance encounter, as most business ventures are, and we started, and 3 months after opening, got locked down in COVID. So it was a very shock start to life. But for various reasons, we actually managed to survive that quite easily because we were a new startup, had very low costs, and bounced back from it and have gone from strength to strength. We opened a restaurant a year after that, a second coffee shop a year after that, and we've got 2 or 3 more coffee shops opening in the next 6 months as well. So it's been an enjoyable ride.
And you sometimes talk about potential threats to the hospitality sector in this country. But it seems from the outside that hospitality is booming. You know, something we talked about the other day, that there are tons of coffee shops and restaurants and bars. And is it not the case that hospitality is doing very well?
It is. Yeah, it can be both of those things. Hospitality is doing well in certain ways and is at very big risks and very vulnerable in other ways. I think the big thing for our industry, along with perhaps retail, leisure, and other industries, is that we rely a lot on minimum wage employees, and that's people working at the base rate of the minimum legal amount we can pay them, which means that in the last few years, minimum wage has gone up on average probably 8-9% a year, and some years, I think in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been 11%. That's a huge increase to our bottom line. And if you think of the cost of a coffee that I sell going up by 10% a year, we're dealing with the brunt of customers saying, hang on a second, huge increases. I mean, I'm sat here with a coffee that I've just paid nearly £4 for, and I didn't even speak to an employee because it was all machine operated. So us trying to maintain levels of service in the service industry is very difficult. And I think a lot of people are experiencing that, whether it's in retail or hospitality. You're dealing with more machines and robots than you are with people nowadays. And that's, I think, almost objectively a bad thing, because socializing, speaking to people, interacting is a very positive net experience.
So I'm a huge advocate for cafes and restaurants, and I've lived in Spain and Italy and in cultures where that sort of going out and speaking to people and having a coffee, it's so much more integral to life in these places. Hilary, I think you're of slightly a different opinion when it comes to this.
I'll probably be very controversial now and lose Alex's friendship completely, but I worry that we have far too many of these hospitality outlets. So you just mentioned there you paid £4 for a cup of coffee. I just find that staggering that people will do that. I will buy a cup of coffee if I'm on a train, for example. But other than that, why do we need all these coffee shops? Because actually those people could be much better employed doing what I might call real jobs. So, I'm making cars or digging roads, doing work that really produces value for society. I mean, is having an artisan-made cup of coffee really useful to us?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you to a certain extent that we can all make coffee at home. We can all cook our own food. And then these people that are employed could potentially be used in industries that are creating more things. I think the big thing I would say is that you've previously mentioned on the podcast productivity being a huge factor. And I've stopped saying the word growth, thanks to you, and started saying productivity is where we should be at. And I would say short to mid-term, where are you going to replace these people? Some staggering amounts of numbers of people, 10, 15, 20% of people in the UK are working in these industries. And if you have jobs for them elsewhere, I'd be more encouraging. But obviously, this industry is creating productivity. It's keeping people busy. And because of the social values of it and the positive experiences you can gain by having experiences in coffee shops and restaurants and hospitality, I would say it is value and it is adding something to society and making town centres more busy for other industries, because we're paying rent to private landlords, we're paying business rates, we're employing people, and we're keeping people coming into town who are then using perhaps public transport, who are then using other facilities, which is really driving that productivity.
And we also can't get away from, and I'm aware of this when we have conversations like this on a podcast, is we lose sight of the societal benefit of things like this. And there is a reason, I think, why people that live in countries with a greater level of sort of facilities like cafes and restaurants and stuff generally do measure higher in well-being, because they're out and about, they're socializing. And it's something we talked about last week on the podcast, the working from home thing, is that there is a benefit to being out and being with other people and bouncing ideas off people. I think that's where innovation can really kick off.
Yeah, and I think if you take a snapshot of the industry and say, stand looking in through the window of a coffee shop or a restaurant, are those people not contributing to society? The customers in there are all in business meetings or on their day off or, taking a lunch break from the office. We, in our business, tailor ourselves towards the co-working market, and we have people sitting in all day that work remotely, and that industry's obviously boomed since COVID. And I would argue that those factors really do mean that the industry has a real value.
I wanted to ask about specifically small business, and I think if you asked people 5-10 years ago, the prevailing wisdom would have been that chains like Starbucks and Costa were going to take over and all independents were going to go under. And as with a lot of things, I think it's shifted and people have sort of caught up to this new narrative when it comes to small business. Why do you think that is? Like, why are places prioritizing small independent cafes? And is that sustainable for the future?
Yeah, I think on a sort of a macro scale, people have a good instinct as a whole, and society will move things collectively towards where we think morally things should align. So when you see huge multinational companies like Starbucks and Amazon, being a vast amount of the control of things that are happening in our country are happening by CEOs in the US or elsewhere, I think collectively as a nation, we say, well, hang on a second, I'd rather have closer control. And that cascades down towards the small operators that do get looked after by landlords, because they say, I don't have to worry too much because I have a good working relationship with an independent person. They offer a lower rent to me than they will to Starbucks because I'm a better prospect. And we're seeing that, I work with city councils locally where I am who say, I'd much rather have an independent here because it's better portrayal of us as a council. If we go and put Costa in, we're not looking to be supporting Sheffield. We're looking to be supporting a big national chain. And so it has that positive effect.
I also think it's vital for average people to be able to start up a business if they want to. And the chances for somebody to get involved in business and say, I'm going to start up a coffee shop, I think we should be incentivizing that, because I think it's better for society as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Alex, you wanted to talk about some of the threats, didn't you? Do you want to just move on to just describing some of the threats facing smaller businesses?
Yeah, I mean, we battle quite a lot with the prospect of inflation being a huge issue in our industry. I've got no doubt in my mind, with very little data to back it up, that when minimum wage goes up by 10%, the average person on £100,000 didn't automatically get a 10% increase in their pay. Whereas every one of my minimum wage employees did by law. And so the threat to our industry is the fact that it's closing the gap between minimum wage employees and professionals earning a professional salary. So to give you an example, when I was managing a venue 10 years ago, I was earning 2.5 to 3 times minimum wage as a professional who had shown acumen and ability and integrity to run a business for somebody else. They rewarded me by paying me a strong salary. We're paying the similar salaries now to the staff who are managing our businesses through the fact that we absolutely have to match the industry. Otherwise, we'd be charging £6 for a coffee. And that means that they're less incentivized than I was to work hard and to gain promotions to those jobs, because they say, well, for 20% less than this, I could be earning minimum wage and have no pressure, no responsibility, and I can just turn up every day and have a nice, easy life. So I worry drastically that incentivizing people to work hard is diminishing with that inflation.
I think a lot of people would argue that a flatter salary structure in businesses is a good thing. So you're arguing against that and saying that actually it's a bit of a something that holds back people's aspirations.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that I will stand and on that sword, because I appreciate that can come across like it's not giving respect to the people that are earning minimum wage. And I do value the fact that we have a baseline and we say, look, in order to live a reasonable life, we think people need to earn this amount of money. But I also see firsthand a huge number of people saying, what's the point in me trying hard? 16 to 18-year-olds saying, well, hang on a second, I can just earn the same amount as that person by just turning up. And I've had 18-year-olds speak to me and say, sorry, but minimum wage, minimum effort, because they are not trained in what I was at 18, which was, hold on a second, I could work hard and be really good at my job. And no discredit to people that do want to put less effort in or have less ability, but there is an incentive And obviously, we all probably would agree that that incentive should be rewarded for hard work as well as natural acumen and ability. But that incentive is being gradually removed, and that really worries me.
And we know that there's been quite significant inflation of minimum wage as well. That presumably is a bit of a challenge for you and your bottom line as a business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a business that you see on the high street would typically have between a 5 and 20-year lease. And in that time, the rent wouldn't go up more than once every 5 years. That's, typical amounts. Often the case that you have a fixed lease for 20 years and you pay the same amount of rent in 19 years' time than you are today. Whereas minimum wage in that time, indexed up would have gone up huge amounts. And it's causing rifts in the industry that you do see big increases. And you go out for a very average meal now and you'll pay £15-16 for a burger or a pizza, where only a few years ago that was £8 or £9. And that's quite a challenge for the industry, because we're the customer-facing part of it. When our wholesale costs go up and when minimum wage goes up, we have nobody to argue with. Those are the facts. And when huge companies say, sorry, the cost of your wholesale beans of coffee or the wholesale dough for your pizzas goes up, that's just the way it has to be. Whereas we're interacting with hundreds of customers on a daily basis that say, why is that? So we're effectively sort of taking ownership for the inflation that the government are the only ones having remotely control of.
So I wanted to ask about, two things. One is, should government be doing things to help small business? And what are those things?
Yeah, I think a lot of people would argue about levelling the playing field. And small business has some advantages over big business, but has a lot of disadvantages in certain areas. I've wrestled with this question. Sebastian asked me this a few days ago, and I've wrestled with this question because I think that supply and demand should drive everything. But, you risk monopolising industries, and we always have had laws against monopolies for that reason, to support smaller companies. And then when you go down from that scale to small businesses, I think, why not give people a chance? One thing I would say as a small business owner is that our laws do support small businesses in quite a lot of ways that I wouldn't have had a clue until being a business owner. The fact that any of us can go and set up a limited company, register it today for a few pounds, trade in business, build up potential debts in VAT or PAYE contributions, and the government will support us by saying that if your business fails, we'll pick up the tab. Big businesses don't have that ability because of the fact that they're more accountable, because we know they're making big profits, whereas small business and startups have a good opportunity to start up in life and limit their risk, limit their personal liabilities.
And what are some of the barriers that you face in doing that, in setting up businesses?
Oh, goodness. I think the barriers are quite often confidence and, the control of what happens if it all goes wrong. Nobody gives you even if you do a business course at school or university, they don't teach you what happens if it goes wrong and how to do things. I did a GCSE in business, and yet nobody told me how to set up a new business, how to register a new business. And when I first wanted to register a new business, I went to an accountant and said, I need some help. And he said, right, all you need to do is go and register a company on Companies House and then set up an account with VAT and PAYE and set up an account on HMRC. And he asked me to do about 6 things that I didn't have a clue how to do. The big disadvantage you have over a big company that can just say, well, we'll just pay somebody to, that's a specialist in all these areas, is that you have to be a generalist. I have to know as much about these specialists as individuals and small teams of people that know so much more. And a lot of that is really, really daunting for individuals or small companies.
We've talked before on the podcast about some of the issues that people struggle with on regulation, or you might say over-regulation. Are there red tape issues that you struggle with?
There are, yeah. I mean, I would be broadly in favour of the amount of regulations that there are. I think that for the most part, health and safety, compliance, all of that sort of thing is fairly reasonable. And again, it can look a lot more scary than it actually is. And again, small businesses are at a disadvantage because a big business will have a team of people working on their insurance policy, whereas I need to spend hours on the phone once every year making sure that my insurance is actually covering me and actually ticks all the boxes. And that's scary. And the big advantage that sort of combats that is, coming back to the limited liability in a small company. But it is difficult. I would say that the regulations and that sort of thing aren't that unreasonable. We want to live in a society that's free and easygoing, but we also want to live somewhere that's safe. And the UK does a pretty good job of balancing that. I sense my brother might disagree with me.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I think it depends on the sector for sure, and I think Hilary will probably have a slightly different experience coming from the world of pensions. So yeah, it depends on the sector, I think, and.
Yeah, it's difficult because obviously I can only speak to a couple of small industries and a small slice of my experience in those in a very short period of time.
Certainly some of the people that I interact with who run their own business get very frustrated by things like having to have an anti-slavery policy or things like that when they do work for public services. So I think there are some things that maybe are a step too far, but I agree with you, Alex, that the people who say, health and safety is problematic. I'm really pleased that we live in a society where we value the importance of people's safety at work.
Yeah, you'll see overstretches, and you'll also see a lot of areas in business where you think, my goodness, I wish the government put a bit more regulatory practice in place to protect me. I work in the property industry as well, and I know that the fire regulations that are in place, I would personally, as a tenant, wish that they were a little stronger, because when it comes to actually living in somewhere that you think, my goodness, the basic minimum regulations that they put in place don't protect me if there's a fire very well, they concern me. And then you obviously have the flip side of it with things like you're saying that can go a little bit overboard.
And what's on your wish list for solutions for small businesses?
That's a good question. I've become quite a fan in business of devolution, because when I've seen councils having more control, I think it's a good thing. And the people closer to the ground have a better eye on what's right for their towns and cities. And so I've seen in Sheffield a pretty good example of that, where the council are doing a very good job. We are so quick to criticise any public figures, and I think when you see it being done well, it should be called out, and they are doing a fantastic job of supporting small businesses and making sure that the city does well and does what the people locally want. So that's the big wish list I'd have, would be for that to continue and for the government to devolve more power.
And I think that if we think about consumers having a say in the sorts of businesses they want to see, right? We do this every day when we go into a business and we spend money. It's us sort of giving it the seal of approval and saying, yes, I value your service and therefore I'm willing to part with my money. In order to have that, we need many different businesses in a town, so you can have a choice between this cafe or this cafe, and you can favour one rather than the other. And that's why I think that it's a good thing to have small businesses, and it's a good thing to have independence as well, because there is a closer link between the consumer and the producer of that good or service.
Yeah, absolutely. And that speaks a lot to one of the SDP values of community, because when you go into your local fish and chip shop, the service is invariably better than when you go into Domino's. It's chalk and cheese, because they have a vested interest in your return business, and therefore small businesses are always going to be able to offer something. And we've talked about it as a very small business about expanding. When I first opened a coffee shop, I had one person and I standing behind the counter for 12 hours a day, and we knew that the service was second to none. We were the best in the business at knowing every customer's drinks, at being so invested in the success of the business. And as soon as we have expanded and hired staff to do that, despite the fact we've been fortunate to have some incredible staff, we have always questioned, has that service, how do we possibly continue that level of service in growth? And I think that's one factor for really supporting small businesses, because we've got aspirations of being a regional company next, and by doing that we are undoubtedly going to limit the level of service, because we're limiting the amount that the people on the ground are invested in the success.
Is there anything else you wanted to make a plug for?
One of the solutions I would say is probably to give more benefits to small business in order to boost the economies locally. And that can be done through means such as limiting business rates, which the councils have done. VAT reductions are crippling for small businesses and far less of a factor for big businesses.
The VAT is very odd, isn't it, on the things you pay VAT on and the things you don't?
Yeah, I spoke to my accountant recently and said, please tell me that VAT isn't this crazy in every industry. And they said, you've no idea. Hospitality has it so strange. So I can tell you a few examples. If I sell a pizza, it has 20% VAT on it, and I have to give 20% to the taxman. If I sell a flatbread, there's 0 rated flat VAT, and I don't need to give that 20% to the taxman. If I sell you a hot or cold coffee to drink in, I have to give 20% to the taxman. A hot coffee to take away, I've added value to that, so therefore there's 20%. But an iced coffee to take away is 0 rated VAT. It is baffling in the hospitality industry why it's so complicated. And you can imagine that how difficult it is for us to calculate our VAT, for us to program our tills, for us to be conscious that we are paying the correct amounts. And a lot of it, I won't be ashamed to say, is finger in the wind and an estimation. And the more that you do that, the more you rely on the morals. So when it comes to me paying my VAT bill, there's plenty of grey areas that I say, do I feel morally obliged to pay more tax in that area? And I have to make those decisions because there are so few areas that are really clean and black and white. And so I'd say simplifying those. The only reason I would really push that is because there is absolutely no reason on so many parts of it. I can see Hilary's face as I'm sort of explaining these intricacies. There's no necessary reason to identify between the different sort of things we're selling. And I understand giving VAT for certain products and not for other products, but simplifying that would be a huge solution for me.
So I can tell you from experience that Alex does a terrific margarita flatbread.
With a bit of added tomato sauce and cheese on top. Absolutely.
There was a big court case, wasn't there, about whether Jaffa cakes were subject to VAT.
Yeah.
So I think the old rule when VAT was introduced that it only applies to luxury goods and not to staples. And a biscuit is counted as a luxury good and a cake is counted as a staple. So cakes aren't subject to VAT. So the Jaffa Cake court case was about whether a Jaffa Cake was a biscuit or a cake.
And a big company like, sorry to interrupt, like McVitie's or whoever owns, the rights to that court case, they can afford to fight that. Small businesses cannot afford to defend themselves on every item. And yet the 20% profit or loss that you're giving me is a huge margin. It makes absolute difference. You imagine if I gave 20% discount on every drink, I'd be inundated with customers. So it's a massive, massive area that could really use some reform. Dare I say that word? Small r.
Small r. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
So as I remember it, they won the argument that a Jaffa Cake is a cake and therefore not subject to VAT, because they argue that the difference between a cake and a biscuit is that if you leave them out, a biscuit goes soft, whereas a cake goes hard.
Yeah.
So that's the basis on which I understand they won the court case. But a plea for more simplicity of our VAT system sounds like a really good solution that we should bear in mind. Thanks for that, Alex. That was really, really interesting to hear from a real life small business person. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So we move on to Culture Club now, and perhaps I should start. We give Alex a little rest for a moment. I want to talk again about ballet. So people might remember I went to my first ballet to see Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, and I have now done my second ballet. Again, continuing the not quite traditional theme, I went to see Carlos Acosta's Nutcracker, which is a fantastic mix of traditional ballet with a kind of Latin theme. So they jazzed up the music, lots of horns and guitars and syncopated rhythms. The Nutcracker doll becomes a Cuban soldier doll, and this is a production at the Lowry Theatre in Salford. And when you go in, there's like a postcard of Havana on the stage. And I don't know how they do this technically, but then when the show starts, you kind of you zoom into the postcard and you're in Havana in a kind of film backdrop on the stage, and then the dancers kind of come into the set that's kind of this kind of digital set behind them. So it was absolutely fantastic. Obviously, it was more traditional ballet in terms of, you've got the Sugar Plum Fairy, and the kind of traditional dances, but also a really nice mix of some Latin dancing as well. So it was absolutely fantastic. Sadly, it was the last performance of this run. It's been a touring around regional theatres, but if it comes back, I would certainly recommend that.
I'm a big fan of the ballet, as I said last time. I've only been once, and I never thought I'd say that. That's a very surprising thing for me to say, but yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I'd love to go again. Okay.
Are you a ballet fan, Alex?
I'm afraid to say not. No, I'm afraid to say. I mean, I would be very open to persuasion because I haven't been to the Ballet Live, and I'm sure I'll get an invitation to go with Sebastian soon, thanks to all your recommendations. So yeah, we'll definitely take it up and let you know if I'm a convert.
Great. And you got something to bring to the Culture Club?
I have indeed. Yeah, I'm going to cheat a little bit and use it as an opportunity to plug my own business, because our coffee shop is called Hygge, and that is a Danish word with Norwegian descent, and it's a fantastic word because it's a whole concept. When we initially opened, we were looking for ideas, and I came across this, and it's all about being comfortable, being cozy, being with loved ones, with friends, and I've read a few books, including a book called the Little Book of Hygge, which Sebastian's holding, and it just, please do, yeah, go on.
I was just gonna say, can I just read out the blurb, because I think it sums it up really nicely.
Absolutely.
You know Hygge when you feel it. It's when you are cuddled up on the sofa with a loved one, or sharing comfort food with your closest friends. It is those crisp blue mornings when the light through your window is just right.
Yeah, fantastic.
I love Hygge, and it's a very hard thing to pin down. And I think when we often do this in the UK, where we take foreign concepts and we sort of I was going to say bastardize them. I'm
I
not
thought
sure
the exact same word. Yeah,
I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but we sort of misalign them and misrepresent them. But that's inevitable. I think that's part of our culture is taking other bits from, bits and pieces from other cultures and making it our own. And so, for example, my form of Hygge would be to have a cup of tea in the afternoon, a blanket over me, and to read a good book. And the texture of the book is important. And this is what I think gets to the heart of it, of what Hygge is. It's to be doing the daily, the mundane, but to be valuing it, and to be thinking about what all of the aspects that goes into it. That he talks, the book itself is gorgeous, and he talks in the book about how important the texture, the feel, the smell is. And while I'm reading it whilst holding this gorgeous binded, don't we call that sort of the way the book is bound is gorgeous. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, a testament to the book is that, contrary to Sebastian's reading, he'll be able to tell you that I've read around 4 or 5 books in my whole life, this being one of them. And that's really a testament to the fact that there's, firstly, a lot of pictures, so it appeals to me. And secondly, lots of graphs and charts about what it's like to be Hygge. Denmark uses more than 2 times the number of candles per capita than the next country in the world. It gives you an example of how they are. If you're in Denmark and you say, that's quite Hyggeligt, it's a very Hygge experience. Or you could invite somebody around and you say, would you like to come for a Hygge evening? And that doesn't just mean come for dinner. It means that there's probably going to be festivities and, it's going to be very comfortable. There's a lot of rules with it. You would never try to pay for the whole bill in a restaurant. You'd make sure that you share. It's all about equality and there's a lot to offer, so I definitely recommend people to that book and to the concept of Hygge in general.
Can I ask 2 questions? One is, how are we spelling this? And second is, who's the book by?
So we are spelling it Hygge. The phonetic would be Hoogah or something to that effect. You'll quite often see that phonetically spelt. The book in question is by Meik, I think is probably how you pronounce it in Danish. And Sebastian's actually met this chap. He runs a place in Copenhagen called the Institute of Happiness, and he's written several follow-up books, including The Little Book of Luca and The Art of Making Memories, both also fantastic reads.
If you're ever in Sheffield, go and find Hygge Cafe. If you say that Take Me Home sent you, you'll get a free coffee.
There's absolutely no promises there from me, but it's worth a shot. Give it a go, guys.
Give it a go, see what happens.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We will see you again next week.
Thanks very much for having me.